Welcome, friends. Today we delve into a new, even dustier, and more hidden archive box. Here lie the chronicles of great absurdities, ingenious scams, and actions driven not by logic, but by sheer stubbornness, boredom, or brilliant madness. Get ready, as the stories you are about to hear will prove that the most unpredictable writer is human nature. If you enjoy stories presented in this format, please support this series with a like and let us know in the comments which city you are tuning in from. In previous episodes, your engagement has been truly remarkable. Believe me, it greatly aids the growth of our community. We have 30 unbelievable tales to share. Let's begin. Story number 1. The Man Who Ordered Chaos at Home. London, the 27th of November, 1810. Berner Street is a quiet, respectable part of the city, home to wealthy widows, doctors, and artists. The foggy morning held no promises beyond the usual routine. The sound of hooves on the cobblestones, the shouts of milkmen, and the scent of coal from chimneys. At number 54, Mrs. Tottenham, a respectable widow, was enjoying her morning tea, completely unaware that in just 1 hour, her name would become the focus of the most grandiose prank in English history. The cause of it all was a wager. The evening prior, the 22-year-old writer and renowned practical joker, Theodore Hook, had bet with a friend 1 guinea that he could make any house in London the most famous address within a week. His friend randomly chose number 54. Hook didn't wait a week. He sat down and began writing. He penned thousands of letters. By 10 o'clock that morning, the first chimney sweep arrived at Mrs. Tottenham's house. The widow politely informed him that his services were not needed. While she spoke with him, a second chimney sweep arrived, followed by a third. Within an hour, 12 chimney sweeps were lined up at her door, each insisting they had been summoned. This was just the beginning. Following them, carts piled high with coal began to arrive, then vans loaded with furniture, followed by 12 pianos ordered for the sitting room, and then bakers carrying gigantic wedding cakes. Doctors, believing there was someone dying in the house, priests rushing to administer last rites, lawyers, undertakers, opticians, shoemakers, pie vendors. The street became an impenetrable jam. Carts blocked each other, horses snorted and coachesmen bickered. Vendors fought for the right to approach the door. But Theodore Hook did not stop at vendors. He wrote letters from Mrs. Tottenham to high-ranking officials. A coach carrying the Lord Mayor of London arrived. Following it, a carriage from the Governor of the Bank of England, the Chairman of the East India Company, and even the carriage of the Duke of York, the commander of the British Army. All had come on urgent summons and were trapped in this chaos. The police were powerless. They attempted to disperse the crowd, but for every cart that left, 2 new ones arrived. By evening, Berner Street had transformed into an apocalyptic scene. Thousands of people, hundreds of carts, abandoned pianos, trampled cakes, and mountains of coal. Theodore Hook himself rented a room in the house across the street, sat by the window with a friend, and spent the entire day laughing as he observed the man-made apocalypse he had crafted with pen and ink, winning a wager of 1 guinea. This individual created chaos for the sake of amusement, orchestrating the flow of people like a conductor. However, in our next story, chaos arose spontaneously, where the weapon was not a command, but an uncontrollable laughter that transformed into an epidemic, one that neither doctors nor shamans could halt. Story number 2. The laughter epidemic that shut down towns. Tanganyika, modern-day Tanzania, 1962. Picture a quiet village called Okasha on the banks of Lake Victoria. The air is humid and thick, carrying the scent of rain and earth. In a missionary girls' school, a lesson is underway. The teacher's monotonous voice, the buzzing of flies, the scratching of pens on paper, a typical day. On January 30th, during recess, 3 students exchanged a joke. They began to laugh. Initially, it was just the usual infectious giggle of girls, but when the bell rang and the lesson resumed, the laughter did not cease. It morphed from merriment into a fit. The girls laughed uncontrollably, gasping for breath and clutching their stomachs. Their faces twisted in pain, tears streamed down their cheeks, yet they could not stop. Soon, another girl began to giggle, then another. By the end of the day, 95 out of 159 students were convulsing with uncontrollable laughter. The teachers were in a state of panic. They tried to calm the girls, offering them water, but nothing worked. The episodes lasted from a few hours to several days. Laughter was interspersed with sobs and screams, only to revert to hysterical giggling. Some developed rashes, while others fainted from exhaustion. The school was closed, and the girls were sent home to their villages. However, it was akin to releasing a virus from a laboratory. The epidemic spread throughout the country. Infected girls transmitted their laughter to their mothers, sisters, and neighbors. Soon, entire villages were gripped by this peculiar plague. People laughed in fields, in huts, at markets. This was not laughter of joy. It was the sound of madness. Doctors could not identify the cause. No bacteria, no viruses. Locals believed it to be a curse or witchcraft inflicted by enemies. The only measure to combat the epidemic was to close schools. A total of 14 schools were shut down, affecting more than 1,000 individuals. The Great Laughter epidemic lasted 18 months. It would wane in one place, only to flare up in another. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it simply vanished. Modern scientists surmise this was a case of mass psychogenic illness, or mass hysteria. The stress from strict school rules and the uncertainty of the future in an independent nation served as triggers. The minds of thousands found the strangest way to vent their frustrations, turning laughter into a weapon against themselves. This laughter was a phantom, an invisible force born in the minds of the people that enslaved their bodies. It illustrates that the most dreadful prison is our own mind. But the hero of our next story decided that the mind is a tool for building rather than for confinement. Fed up with laws and taxes, he made the decision to construct his own country from scratch, piling it up in the middle of the ocean with a shovel and naming it a republic. Story number 3. A republic built on sand and audacity. The South Pacific, south of the islands of Tonga. The year was 1971. American millionaire Michael Oliver, who had amassed a fortune through real estate and coin sales, grew weary of taxes and government oversight. He was a libertarian through and through, and fantasized about a place devoid of government. Since there were no unclaimed lands left on the world map, he decided to create his own. Oliver discovered the Minerva Reef, 2 coral horseshoes that lay submerged during high tide, a no-man's land. No nation had laid claim to it, as it was merely a perilous shoal in the middle of the ocean. Oliver hired barges filled with sand from Australia. Tons of sand were dumped onto the reefs, raising them above sea level. On this artificial piece of land, he hoisted a flag and proclaimed the establishment of the Republic of Minerva. He issued his own currency, the Minerva dollar, printed passports, and sent letters to the leaders of 100 nations requesting recognition. He promised the absence of taxes, complete freedom for enterprise, and a paradise for investors. The world rolled its eyes, but the neighboring kingdom of Tonga took it seriously. King Taufa Ahau Tupou I of Tonga was an imposing figure, both in status and stature, weighing around 200 kilograms. He glanced at the map and decided he would not tolerate a smuggler's base near his shores. In June 1972, the king personally led a military expedition. The Tongan fleet, comprising a royal yacht, a landing craft, and a tugboat, approached Minerva. On board was the king himself, the national orchestra, and a squad of prisoners assigned to the role of Marines. The battle for the Republic of Minerva was swift. President Oliver and his administration prudently stayed away. Tongan soldiers, former inmates, landed on the sand, took down the Minerva flag, and raised the Tongan one. The orchestra, standing knee-deep in water, solemnly played the national anthem. The king declared the reefs part of the kingdom. Michael Oliver attempted to protest to the United Nations, but no one came to the defense of the sandcastle. A few years later, nature wrapped up what the king had started. Storms eroded the deposited sand, and the Republic of Minerva once again disappeared beneath the waves, becoming merely a footnote in the annals of curiosities. Michael Oliver tried to create a country from nothing, but the hero of our next story constructed something from garbage. He built a palace that became a monument to solitude and unrequited love, using only what others tossed away. Story number 4. The Postman Who Built a Castle from Dreams and Stones. France. The village of Autrive in the year 1879. Ferdinand Cheval was an ordinary rural postman. He was 43 years old. Silent, withdrawn, and each day he walked 32 kilometers, delivering letters to nearby villages. His life seemed gray and dreary, much like the dusty road beneath his feet. But one day in April, his foot caught on a stone of unusual shape. He picked it up. The stone reminded him of some fantastical creature. He placed it in his pocket. The following day, he discovered another stone, and yet another. In the mind of a simple postman who had never ventured beyond his canton and lacked any architectural training, a mad idea formed. He resolved to construct the perfect palace, a palace that would encompass all styles and epochs of every god and every being he had seen on postcards and in magazines delivered to the recipients. Every day for the next 33 years, Ferdinand Cheval set out on his route with a wheelbarrow. While delivering mail, he collected stones. The locals deemed him insane. They observed him, tired after night shifts, mixing cement by the light of an oil lamp and laying his finds. He built alone. His palace grew slowly, like a living organism. It wasn't a building in the conventional sense. It was a hallucination made of stone. Here were Hindu temples, Egyptian tombs, medieval castles, Swiss chalets, and mosques. The walls were adorned with figures of octopuses, caimans, elephants, and fairies. He imbued the stone with shells and glass. Cheval completed his construction in 1912 when he was 76 years old. The palace measured 26 meters in length and 10 meters in height. He wished to be buried in his creation, like a pharaoh, but French laws prohibited burial outside of cemeteries. Cheval did not give up. At the age of 78, he went to the local graveyard and began to build once more. For another 8 years, he erected a sepulchre of silence and eternal rest in the same fantastical style. He passed away at 88, just a year after finishing the tomb. His ideal palace still stands today, recognized as a masterpiece of naive architecture, a monument to the persistence of one man who proved that a dream can be built with one's own hands, stone by stone. Cheval built to leave a mark, but the hero of our next story became famous for vanishing without a trace, a name, or even a parachute with which he jumped from an airplane carrying a bag of money. Story number 5. A ghost in a business suit with $200,000. Portland, Airport, November 24, 1971, Thanksgiving Day. A man in his 40s, dressed in a dark suit, a white shirt, and a black tie with a pearl tie pin, approached the Northwest Orient Airlines counter. He purchased a ticket to Seattle under the name Dan Cooper. He paid in cash. He took his seat in row 18 on board a Boeing 727. He ordered a bourbon with soda. He was polite, calm, and nothing about him stood out. Soon after takeoff, he handed a flight attendant a note. The girl, accustomed to flirtations from passengers, slipped it into her pocket without reading it. "Miss, you'd better take a look at that note," Cooper said softly. "I have a bomb." He opened his briefcase. Inside, the flight attendant saw red cylinders, wires, and a large battery. His demands were specific and surprisingly modest for such a risk. $200,000 in $20 bills and 4 parachutes. Not 2, but 4. This made the police suspect he intended to take hostages. The airplane circled over Seattle while money and parachutes were gathered on the ground. Cooper remained unflustered. He settled the bill for the drinks and even insisted that the flight attendant keep the change. Upon landing, he released all passengers and 2 flight attendants in exchange for cash and parachutes. The pilots, flight engineer, and 1 flight attendant remained on board. Cooper commanded that they fly to Mexico, but at minimum speed, with the landing gear and flaps deployed, at no higher than 3,000 meters and, crucially, with the cabin depressurized. The Boeing took off into the night during a torrential, icy rain. 2 fighter jets followed the aircraft, but in the darkness and clouds, they lost visual contact. Somewhere over the wild forests of Washington state at 2013, a light in the cockpit flashed. indicating that the aft stairway had been opened. The cabin pressure shifted dramatically. When the plane touched down in Reno for refueling, the cabin was empty. D.B. Cooper had vanished with the money and the parachutes. Only his cheap tie with a clip was left on the seat. The FBI launched the most extensive manhunt in its history. They combed through forests, dredged rivers, and scrutinized thousands of suspects, but found very little. In 1980, a boy discovered a bundle of decaying $20 bills along the Columbia River, with serial numbers matching the ransom. Did Cooper survive? A nighttime jump in the rain, in a forest, while wearing a business suit and loafers, using a training parachute that was uncontrollable. His chances were minimal, yet the body was never found. The case of D.B. Cooper, as it was mistakenly labeled by journalists, remains the only unsolved aircraft hijacking in American aviation history. He stepped into the void and became a legend. However, the hero of our next story also stepped into the void to survive, managing to live where it seemed physically impossible, floating on a piece of a ship among sharks, with only a watch that had stopped at the moment of the disaster. Story number 6. The fever that made a city dance to exhaustion. Strasbourg, July 15, 18. The cobblestones radiated heat from the relentless sun. In the narrow streets lined with timber-framed houses, a thick, stagnant air hung heavily. The townsfolk sought refuge in the shade, lazily swatting away flies. Nothing foreshadowed that this drowsy summer day would mark the beginning of one of the strangest and most unsettling epidemics in human history. A woman named Frau Trofea stepped out of her home and onto the street. She wasn't heading to the market or to church. She simply stood in the middle of the street and began to dance. Without any music, without any reason. This was not a dance of joy. Her movements were erratic and jerky. Her arms flew upward and her feet beat a feverish rhythm on the dusty stones. There was no smile on her face, only a mask of painful trance. Her eyes were vacant, staring into nothingness. Neighbors emerged from their homes, whispering in astonishment. Children pointed in disbelief. Her husband tried to pull her home, but she broke free and continued her silent, frenzied dance. She danced for 1 hour, then another. She danced until sunset, collapsing onto the pavement from exhaustion. Her feet were bloodied and worn. Yet the next morning, she rose and began to dance once more. By the end of the week, 34 more people had joined her. Within a month, the city was enveloped in a full-blown mania. About 400 citizens, including men, women, and children, were dancing in the streets and squares. They couldn't stop. The city council was in a state of panic. Doctors threw their hands up, speculating that it was just exuberance. The magistrate made the most absurd decision imaginable. They concluded that the illness needed to be danced away. The authorities cleared the city's markets, constructed wooden stages, and hired musicians. Drums thundered through the streets of Strasbourg, while bagpipes and flutes wailed. Healthy individuals played music to encourage the sick to dance even more fervently. It turned into a grotesque carnival. Hundreds of people, resembling puppets pulled by invisible strings, writhed in a feverish dance. They collapsed from heart attacks, exhaustion, or strokes, but others kept moving, oblivious to their surroundings. The epidemic ceased as suddenly as it had begun, by September, leaving the city in shock. Scholars continue to debate the causes. Was it mass poisoning with a herb that induced hallucinations, or a case of mass psychosis triggered by hunger and stress? But the fact remains, a whole city plunged into a dancing frenzy for several weeks, an event that defies rational explanation. Strasbourg became a victim of an inexplicable human impulse, of chaos born within the bodies of hundreds. However, sometimes chaos is not an internal malfunction, but rather a series of external, comical, yet dangerous blunders. Our next tale is about a ship that sailed under the banner of pure misfortune, turning every outing at sea into a disaster. Story number 7. The Ship of Misfortune and its Captain Optimist. The Pacific Ocean, World War II. Among the hundreds of American vessels battling the Japanese fleet was one that sailors sought to avoid. It was nicknamed Poor Willie D. Officially, it was called USS William D., a Fletcher-class destroyer. Its story is a comedy of errors that barely escaped, resulting in a tragedy of catastrophic proportions. November 1943. The first mission for Willie D. Escort the battleship Iowa, which carried President Franklin Roosevelt on board. He was en route to a secret conference in Tehran to meet with Stalin and Churchill. The adventures started right at the port. As Willie D. was pulling away from the pier, it snagged the anchor of a neighboring destroyer, tearing away its mooring lines, life rafts, and anything that was loosely secured. Not the best of starts. The following day, during a drill, a depth charge was accidentally dropped from the ship. The explosion occurred right beneath the battleship Iowa. The 45,000-ton vessel was jolted so violently that the president nearly toppled out of his wheelchair. The security detail believed it was an attack from a German submarine, prompting the entire convoy to initiate anti-submarine maneuvers. But the climax occurred on the third day. President Roosevelt wanted to observe a torpedo drill. Willie D. was supposed to launch a practice torpedo at Iowa. Captain Wilfred Walter, known for his optimism, was determined to execute everything flawlessly. However, the torpedo man mistakenly left the live warhead in the torpedo tube. The torpedo headed straight towards the battleship with the president on board. Panic ensued on Willie D. They were supposed to immediately alert the Iowa via radio, but there was an order on the ship to maintain radio silence to avoid revealing their location. The signalman began to frantically wave his flags, but confused the signals and transmitted that a torpedo was heading in the opposite direction. Finally, in desperation, Captain Walter broke the order and shouted into the radio, "Left, turn right! Left, turn right!" The Iowa's call sign was heard on the battleship. The massive vessel began a clumsy turn. The torpedo passed just a few meters from the stern and exploded in the ship's wake. Following this incident, Willie D. was relieved of his command. For the first time in the history of the U.S. Navy, an entire ship was detained. The captain faced a tribunal, but President Roosevelt personally pardoned him, saying, "Mistakes happen." The ship was sent to the Aleutian Islands, far away from important personnel. There, it managed to shell the base commander's house, mistaking it for a target. Fate caught up with poor Willie D. in 1945 near Okinawa. A Japanese kamikaze missed and fell into the water next to the ship, but its bomb exploded beneath the hull of the destroyer, tossing it into the air. The ship struggled for 3 hours to stay afloat. Surprisingly, not a single crew member was lost in that final disaster. Willie D. demonstrated that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is not the opponent, but one's own bad luck. However, the hero of our next story, in contrast, embodied fortune. He was a cat that served on 3 ships, 2 British and 1 German, surviving the sinking of each and becoming a legend of the Royal Navy. Story number 8. Unsinkable Sam. A cat with 9 lives and 3 flags. The Atlantic Ocean, World War II. Amidst the roar of cannon fire, the wail of sirens, and the creaking metal of sinking ships, was one soul that, it seemed, had struck a personal pact of non-aggression with Poseidon. This was a simple black and white cat. History did not preserve his true name, but sailors knew him as Oscar, later dubbed Unsinkable Sam. His odyssey began aboard the German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine. On May 27, 1941, after a fierce hunt, the British fleet caught up with and sank the Bismarck. Of the 2,200 crew members, only 114 survived. When the British destroyer Cossack picked up the survivors, the sailors spotted something unusual. Amidst the oil slicks and cold waves, a black and white cat sat calmly on a piece of driftwood. He was wet, angry, but completely unharmed. The British, following an unwritten naval law stating that a cat should not be left behind, took him aboard. They named him Oscar. Thus, the Nazi cat became a British cat. Oscar served on the Cossack for several months, diligently catching mice and earning the crew's affection. However, on October 24th of that same year, the destroyer, escorting a convoy from Gibraltar, was torpedoed by a German submarine. The explosion tore off the bow of the ship. 159 sailors perished. The ship was sinking. The crew was evacuated to the destroyer Legion. And again, amid the chaos, someone remembered Oscar. They found him calm as Buddha on a piece of wood and transferred him to the Legion. The Cossacks sank. After that incident, it seemed the cat was promoted in rank. He was assigned to serve on the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, which played a pivotal role in the sinking of his first home, the Bismarck. The irony of fate is worthy of a dramatist. On the Ark Royal, the cat earned a new nickname, Unsinkable Sam. However, whether it was a curse or a good luck charm, depending on perspective, it followed him closely. On the 14th of November 1941, while returning from Malta, the Ark Royal was torpedoed. The aircraft carrier sank slowly, allowing nearly the entire crew to escape. When the time came to abandon the ship, one of the officers on a lifeboat spotted Sam floating on a piece of debris, grumpy but entirely unharmed. After 3 ships had been lost within 6 months, the British Admiralty determined that enough was enough. Sam was retired to shore. He was appointed the chief mouser at the Governor-General's residence in Gibraltar, and later transferred to a sailor's home in Belfast, where he lived a long and peaceful life until 1955. His pastel portrait still hangs in the National Maritime Museum in Greenwich. Unsinkable Sam, the cat who served under 2 warring flags and outlived all his captains, became an immortal symbol of maritime fortune and resilience. Sam survived at sea, but the hero of our next story survived on land, at the very heart of the enemy's capital. He was an American soldier who escaped captivity and hid in Berlin, working on the railway and even meeting the daughter of a German official while the Red Army was storming the city. Story number 9. The soldier who switched sides in the midst of the battle for Berlin. Joseph Beerley was a man born for trouble. In 1944, he was a sergeant in the 101st Airborne Division of the United States, famously known as the Screaming Eagles. He was dropped over Normandy just hours before D-Day. He blew up power stations, got captured, escaped, and was captured again. The Germans considered him far too American, brash, undaunted, and perpetually seeking ways to flee. After several failed attempts, he was sent to a POW camp known as Stalag 3C in eastern Germany, near the Polish border. In January 1945, as the sound of Soviet artillery began to rumble from the east, Joe and 2 of his comrades escaped once more. They split up. Joe, guided by the sound of cannon fire, headed east towards the Russians, hoping to find Soviet troops and join them. For several weeks, he wandered through the frozen forests, subsisting on whatever he could find. One morning he came upon a clearing and saw what he had been seeking, a Soviet T-34 tank emblazoned with a white star on its armor. Joe emerged from the woods with his hands raised, shouting the only phrase he knew in Russian, "I am an American comrade." The tank crew initially aimed to shoot him, mistaking him for a German spy. But Joe was lucky. The battalion commander was a woman. She didn't speak English, but she had a political officer who knew a bit of the language. Using gestures and broken Russian English, Joe explained who he was and expressed his desire to fight alongside them against the Nazis. The Soviet female major, impressed by his story and audacity, laughed and welcomed him into her battalion. Joseph Beerley, a sergeant in the U.S. Army, transformed into a machine gunner in a Soviet tank battalion. Over the course of the following month, he fought alongside the Red Army. He took part in the liberation of the very camp from which he had escaped, watching with satisfaction the astonished faces of the former guards. In February, his battalion came under aerial bombardment, resulting in Joe sustaining serious injuries. He was sent to a Soviet hospital, where an astonishing twist of fate occurred. Marshal Georgy Zhukov visited for an inspection, and upon learning that the only American fighting in the Red Army was in the ward, he personally visited Beerley. Impressed by Beerley's story, Zhukov provided him with official documents and orders directing all Soviet authorities to assist the American comrade in returning home. With these papers, Joseph Beerley made his way to Moscow. Upon arriving at the American embassy, he was initially arrested as a deserter or spy. No one could fathom that an American sergeant, long thought dead in battle in Normandy, could appear in Moscow dressed as a Soviet soldier. It was only after his fingerprints were verified that his identity was confirmed. He returned to the United States, got married, became a father, and lived a long life. His son, John Beerley, later became the U.S. ambassador to Russia. Joseph Barely is the only soldier in history to have officially fought for both the United States and the Soviet Union during World War II. While Joseph Barely fought in a tank, the heroine of our next story waged her war on stage. She was an opera singer who used her voice not for arias, but for saving lives, hiding people in dressing rooms, and secretly smuggling them across borders right under the Nazis' noses. Story number 10. The Valkyrie Who Sang for Kings and Hid Fugitives. Australia, the 1930s. Marjorie Lawrence was not just an opera singer. She was a force of nature. With a powerful soprano capable of overpowering an orchestra and an athletic physique, she would leap onto a horse in Wagner's The Ring, a feat no diva had accomplished before her. Moreover, she possessed a tenacious character that didn't recognize the word no. She conquered the Paris Opera, the Metropolitan Opera in New York, and even sang for King George VI. Yet, in 1941, at the peak of her fame, her world collapsed. During a rehearsal in Mexico, she experienced weakness in her legs. A few days later, she became paralyzed from the waist down, diagnosed with polio. For an opera singer whose career hinged on standing on stage, this was a death sentence. Doctors informed her that she would never walk again. Marjorie spent a year in despair, but eventually, her Australian spirit prevailed. She declared, "If I cannot stand, I will sing seated." She developed an exercise regimen, strengthening her back and diaphragm muscles to the extent that she could hit notes from her wheelchair with the same power as before. In 1942, she returned to the stage of the Metropolitan Opera as Isolde. When the curtain lifted and the audience saw her in a chair, the hall fell silent until she began to sing. This became one of the greatest triumphs in opera history, but it wasn't the main story. The most significant events transpired during the war. Marjorie, an Australian citizen, was able to move freely through occupied Europe. She performed concerts for German officers who adored her Wagnerian repertoire. They applauded her, unaware that behind the scenes, her Bremen flat had turned into a transit point for the resistance movement. She used her status as an untouchable star to hide downed Allied pilots, Jewish children, and members of the resistance. Under her house near Paris was a secret cellar where people awaited evacuation to safety. She transported encrypted messages hidden within sheet music. Her boldest maneuver occurred at the Spanish border. Her vehicle was stopped by a German patrol. An officer began to ask questions. Under the blankets in the car was a family of Jewish refugees. Any noise could lead to execution for all. Marjorie, seated in her chair, smiled at the officer and began to sing. She performed the aria of Brunhilde, loudly, so loudly that the windows in the car rattled. The astonished officer, who may have heard her in Paris, saluted and waved her on. "Proceed, madame." Marjorie Lawrence, a seated Valkyrie, not only overcame illness but also waged her quiet war, using her voice as both weapon and shield. She saved lives through art, but the hero of our next story rescued art through audacity. He was a curator at the Louvre who single-handedly organized the evacuation of the Mona Lisa and thousands of other masterpieces right under the noses of the advancing Nazis, hiding them in castles throughout France. Story number 11. The Man Who Stole the Louvre from Hitler. Paris, late August 1939. The air was heavy with fear. Everyone understood that war was imminent. A silence would settle over the Louvre, but it was the calm before the storm. Deputy Director of the museum Jacques Chauchard gazed at the masterpieces he vowed to protect: the Mona Lisa, the Winged Victory of Samothrace, the Venus de Milo. He knew that Hitler and Goering were passionate collectors, and if occupation occurred, they would take everything. On August 25th, Chauchard made a decision. He announced the closure of the Louvre for 3 days due to renovations. This was a lie. That very night, the largest and most secret operation to save art in history began. Hundreds of museum staff, curators, restorers, and ordinary workers commenced the evacuation. It was a logistical nightmare. 3,693 works of art, massive paintings by Rubens and Veronese, were rolled up and packed into gigantic cylinders. The Mona Lisa, too fragile for transport, was secured in a special box with triple protection. A code number MN00001 was written on the box, along with a warning about its fragility in red letters. The enormous winged Victory of Samothrace, weighing several tons, was lowered down the main staircase on wooden ramps. This took several hours. 203 trucks, including ambulances, taxis, and cargo vans, lined up in a convoy. At night, without lights, the convoy left Paris. The destinations were dozens of castles and abbeys across France that Georges had previously selected as secret storages. When a few days later German troops entered Paris, the officer responsible for safeguarding the artwork, Count Franz von Wulfdenich, who ironically was a secret anti-fascist, walked into the Louvre. The halls were deserted, with only empty frames hanging on the walls. "Where are the paintings?" he inquired. Jacques Jajar, who had remained in Paris, shrugged in response to the restoration efforts. Over the next 4 years, Jajar's team, referred to as the Monuments, waged a quiet war. They constantly shifted treasures from one castle to another, staying one step ahead of the Gestapo and the SS art experts. The Mona Lisa changed safe havens 6 times during the conflict. On one occasion, a truck transporting valuables broke down in the middle of the road. Local residents helped fix it without even knowing the precious cargo they were saving. Jacques Jajar, a modest civil servant, executed the con of the century, deceiving the entire leadership of the Third Reich. As a result of his efforts, nearly all the Louvre's treasures returned to their rightful places intact after the war. Jajar saved the paintings. Now our next story features a hero who saved a city. He was a simple plumber who single-handedly halted a monstrous fire threatening to engulf London, using nothing but a wrench and his knowledge of underground utilities. Story number 12. The Plumber Who Extinguished the Great London Fire. London, the night of December 29, 1940. Hundreds of German incendiary bombs rained down on the city. It was the most terrifying night of the London Blitz, later referred to as the Second Great Fire of London. The business district, known as the City, turned into a fiery inferno. Fire crews were powerless. Glass melted, and stone walls shattered. Yet the biggest problem was water. The River Thames was at low tide, and the old Victorian pipes could not withstand the pressure, bursting one after another. Fire pumps were drawing in air. In the very center of this apocalypse, underground in a labyrinth of pipes and valves, there was one man. His name was Francis Tibbets. He was neither a firefighter nor a soldier. He was an inspector for the London Water Authority, or simply put, a plumber. Tibbets and his small team had received orders to secure water for St. Paul's Cathedral at all costs. This cathedral, the creation of Christopher Wren, was a symbol of British resilience. Its loss would be a blow to the nation more severe than losing an army. Tibbets knew underground London better than his own apartment. He was aware of the location of every valve, gate, and backup pipeline. When the main pipe serving the city ruptured, Tibbets did not panic. He descended into the sewer. Bombs were falling around him. The ground shook. Above, through the grates, a crimson sky was visible. Water was rising in the tunnel, threatening to drown him. By touch, in the dark, relying on memory, he began his work. He sealed damaged sections, opened bypass routes, and connected pipelines that had not been in use for decades. He played the London plumbing system like an organ, redirecting precious water flows to fire pumps that were already struggling. It was a race against time. Several times he was nearly crushed by collapsing walls. One of his aides lost his life. Yet, Francis continued to turn the valves. Thanks to him, firefighters were able to protect St. Paul's Cathedral. Its dome, surrounded by a sea of flames, became a symbol of hope for the entire world. The famous photograph titled "St. Paul Survives," taken that night, circulated through all the newspapers. However, no one knew that behind this photograph was an unnamed plumber soaked to his knees in water underground. Francis Tibbets did not receive any medals. His name did not make it into textbooks. He simply returned home, had a cup of tea, and went back to work the next day. The Tibetans saved the city, but the hero of our next story saved something more fragile: hope. He was a clown who performed in the Theresienstadt concentration camp, making children who were marching to their deaths laugh, proving that laughter can be an act of resistance. Story number 13. Cabaret on the Brink of Hell. Imagine a city that appears on no map, a city built from lies. Behind the walls of the old fortress of Theresienstadt in Czechoslovakia in 1944, the Nazis created their most cynical masterpiece. They erected a model ghetto. Here, to mislead the Red Cross, they simulated normal life. There were cafes, a theater, and a jazz orchestra. And this theater had its own director. His name was Kurt Gehren. Before the war, he was the king of the Berlin Bohemia, huge and charismatic. He had starred in films with Marlene Dietrich and sang in Brecht's Three-Penny Opera. He was a star. Now he was inmate number such and such. But the Nazis decided to exploit his talent. The camp commandant ordered Gehren to create a cabaret to entertain the prisoners. Thus, the cabaret carousel was born. Every week, in a dusty barrack on an improvised stage, Kurt Gehren and other performers, along with inmates, put on shows. They sang songs about pre-war Paris, recited poetry, and performed funny skits. And the audience? 150,000 Jews, emaciated by hunger, typhus, and fear, laughed. It was the strangest laughter on earth. Laughter was an act of resistance. They laughed at the soup made from potato peels. They applauded, fully aware that tomorrow their name might end up on the list for deportation to Auschwitz. In this city of lies, laughter was the only truth, the only currency that could not be taken away. The culmination of this theater of the absurd was an order to film a propaganda movie called The Führer Gives the Jews a City. Gehren, the great director, was forced to create a film about how happily the Jews lived under the protection of the Third Reich. These were the most surreal shots in the history of cinema. For several days, people were given better food so they wouldn't look like skeletons. Empty shops were stocked with goods that would be confiscated once the command "cut" was given. Children were forced to smile as they ate oranges, fruit they had seen for the first time. An orchestra played Mozart against a backdrop of newly painted facades. Kurt Gehren stood behind the camera and created the greatest lie, hoping that this work would save his life. The film was completed. It turned out convincing. The Red Cross delegation left satisfied, and a few days after the filming, all the actors and even the children from the movie were loaded into freight cars. The final transport from Theresienstadt carried them to Auschwitz. Kurt Gehren and his wife were sent to the gas chamber immediately upon arrival. He died on the 28th of October, 1944. The following day, Himmler ordered the cessation of all gas chamber operations. The director, who had gifted his friends a final laugh, missed his chance for salvation by 24 hours. Gehren wielded art as a shield in a world where truth was a crime. However, in our next story, a simple piece of art became a weapon. A melody broadcast over the radio transformed into a signal for revolution, demonstrating that a song could be louder than 1,000 cannons. Story number 14. The song that toppled a dictatorship. Portugal. The night of the 24th of April, 1974. The country was frozen in time. For almost half a century, it had been under the rule of a new state, the longest fascist regime in Europe. Censorship, secret police, PIDE, colonial wars in Africa, poverty. People are afraid to speak even in whispers in their kitchens. But in the barracks, a conspiracy is brewing. A group of young officers, weary of the senseless war, decides to overthrow the dictatorship. They call themselves the Captains Movement. They have a plan, but how to issue the order for a whole army spread across the country without arousing suspicion from the secret police? Phones are tapped and couriers are unreliable. They need a signal. A signal that all will hear, but only those meant to understand will grasp its meaning. They choose the most innocent yet powerful weapon, music. At 22:55 on the 24th of April, the song Grandola, Vila Morena plays on the national radio. This song, which had represented Portugal in the Eurovision Song Contest, is a sweet, sentimental ballad about love. For millions of Portuguese, it's just another hit. For the conspirators, it's the first signal. The operation begins. Be ready. The second decisive signal is to be delivered after midnight. It will be the same song, Grândola, Vila Morena, penned by an outlawed communist poet. At 0:20, the announcer from Radio Renascença states, "In a few moments, a song given to me by friends will play." He reads the opening lines and puts on the record. Across the nation, in barracks, homes, and taverns, hundreds of officers, leaning close to their radios, hear a hoarse male voice singing about brotherhood and freedom. This was the password. Tanks roll into the streets of Lisbon. Soldiers occupy government buildings, airports, and radio stations. This is the strangest revolution in history. It unfolds with almost no shots fired. In the morning, as citizens step into the streets and see the tanks, they do not flee in fear. They approach the soldiers and begin to thrust flowers into the barrels of rifles and machine guns, red carnations, which that day seller Celeste Cairo distributed to anyone who wanted them. By evening, Lisbon is awash in blooms. Soldiers and civilians embrace on the tank's turrets. Dictator Marcelo Caetano surrenders. A 48-year dictatorship collapsed in a single day amid the sounds of a song. This revolution has been chronicled as the Carnation Revolution. It proved that sometimes the most effective weapon is not steel, but a melody that unites hearts. Music changed the fate of the nation. In our subsequent tale, the fate of many was altered by an ordinary deck of playing cards. For American prisoners of war in Vietnam, it became not merely a source of entertainment, but a secret code that assisted them in surviving and deceiving their captors. Story number 15. The Card House That Withstood Torture. Vietnam. Hanoi Hilton Prisoner of War Camp, 1967. American pilot James Robinson Robbie Reisner is confined to a solitary cell. Isolation is one of the most brutal forms of torture. Inmates are forbidden from communicating. Any conversation, noise, or glance is met with violence. The captors aim to break their spirit, turning officers into frightened individuals. However, Reisner and his fellow prisoners discover a method to breach the silence. They revive an old prison telegraph. The code is based on a 5x5 grid where each letter corresponds to 2 knocks. The first knock indicates the row number, and the second denotes the column number. They tap on the walls, cough, and sweep the floor in a specific rhythm. In doing so, they convey news, support each other, and coordinate resistance activities. Yet, this code is slow and perilous. One day, during an interrogation, one of the prisoners notices a deck of playing cards on the Vietnamese officer's desk and has an idea. Upon returning to his cell, he starts tapping on the wall, having conceived a new card-based code. Each card represents a letter or phrase. Ace of Hearts, hello. King of Spades, commander is wounded. Thus, the card code system was born. They did not possess actual cards. The entire deck of 52 cards existed solely in their minds. Each prisoner had to memorize it. The code was brilliant in its simplicity and discretion. Instead of tapping out long sequences, they could simply cough, sneeze, or drop a bowl in a specific manner, simulating the sound of a card hitting a table. A brief cough for hearts, a dull thud for spades, a scrape for diamonds, and a drawn-out sigh for clubs. This code became their salvation. They could communicate right in front of guards who had no clue about what was transpiring. They organized protests, warned each other about traitors, and passed on information about new captives. They could even play bridge by passing cards through coughs. The cards evolved into a symbol of their unity. When one of the prisoners, Lieutenant Mike Christian, was caught embroidering the American flag onto the lining of his shirt, he was brutally beaten. Upon returning to his cell, he could barely move. Yet the next day, he resumed his embroidery. When asked via the telegraph why he was taking such risks, he replied, "So we have a flag for the morning formation." The deck of cards that did not exist helped these individuals maintain their sanity, honor, and lives. It transformed a crowd of broken individuals into a brotherhood that could not be defeated by torture or years of isolation. The cards saved lives. But in our next story, life was rescued by an ordinary bee, or rather, millions of bees that became unexpected allies in one of the strangest battles of World War I. Story number 16. The Battle of the Bees, or the Sweetest Truce. East Africa, November 1914. The First World War reached even this exotic corner of the planet. British colonial troops attempted to seize the port of Tonga, which was held by German Askari soldiers under the legendary Colonel Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. The British were confident of a swift victory, boasting superior numbers. However, they failed to consider two crucial elements: the brilliance of Lettow-Vorbeck and the local people with wings. The British landing forces disembarked on the shore and began their advance. The Germans and Askari, hidden among the vegetation, met them with a torrential barrage of gunfire. The attack faltered. The following day, the British decided to flank the enemy positions by maneuvering through thick underbrush. Soldiers, suffering from the heat and insect bites, slogged through the jungle. Suddenly, they heard a growing hum. At first they thought it was aircraft overhead, but the sound was different, deeper, vibrating, alive. They had disturbed the nests of wild African bees. These were not ordinary honeybees. They were aggressive, deadly insects whose stings could cause anaphylactic shock. Thousands, even hundreds of thousands of enraged bees descended upon the British contingent. In a panic, the soldiers dropped their rifles and machine guns, fleeing in terror. They ran back towards the shore, desperately swatting at the buzzing swarm, diving into the ocean to escape. But the bees pursued them. The Germans, witnessing this scene from their trenches, were initially taken aback, then broke into laughter. Their adversary, the mighty British Army, was routed by a swarm of insects. The bee attack utterly demoralized the British. Soldiers refused to return to the jungle. Many suffered from severe swelling, with some succumbing to stings. Realizing the morale was shattered, the command issued a retreat order. The battle for Tonga, which would later be referred to as the Battle of the Bees, ended in a humiliating defeat for the British. Colonel Lettow-Vorbeck, a man with a sense of humor, modestly noted in his report that the enemy's main forces had been dispersed by our smallest yet most numerous allies. The bees had halted the army, but in our next story, an army was stopped by just one man. He was a farmer who refused to sell his land for the construction of an airport and lived for 30 years in a small house surrounded by runways. Story number 17. The Farmer Who Lived Amid the Runway. Japan, Chiba Prefecture, late 60s. The government decided to build a new international Narita airport to relieve Tokyo's congestion. The plan was grand, but there was one problem. The land belonged to farmers who had cultivated rice and vegetables there for generations. The government began forcibly acquiring the parcels. Most farmers, once compensated, surrendered. However, not all. Several families, led by a man named Takao Shito, refused to leave. For them, it was not just land. It was their ancestors' land, their history, their lives. They began the struggle. Protests, clashes with the police, barricades. It was a real war that lasted for years. But the government remained unyielding. The airport was constructed around defiant farms. Bulldozers demolished neighbors' homes and paved over fields with concrete. The farm of Takashi Shida gradually found itself isolated in the midst of a massive construction site. In 1978, Narita Airport was inaugurated, yet it did not turn out as originally envisioned. Right in the heart of the airport grounds, amid taxiways and the future runway, several farms remained. Shida and his neighbors continued their lives there. Imagine this scene. Enormous Boeing 747s, roaring with engines, taxi mere meters from cabbage patches. In the morning, Shida tended to his vegetables while planes soared over him, transporting thousands of people to far corners of the world. His existence transformed into a surreal spectacle. To return home, he had to pass through a checkpoint and show his identification. At night, his house was illuminated by the lights of the runway. The noise was deafening, yet he grew accustomed to it. Years rolled on. Other farmers capitulated, selling their land, yet Takashi Shita remained the last. His humble home and small plot of land became a symbol of resistance. He lived there until 2020. For over half a century, he fought his quiet battle. he did not emerge victorious. The airport operates, but he did not emerge defeated either. He compelled a multi-billion-dollar corporation and an entire government to acknowledge the rights of one small individual. Ultimately, the authorities reached a compromise and altered expansion plans, leaving his farm undisturbed. Takashi Shita proved that the strongest foundation is not concrete, but stubbornness. However, the hero of our next story built his foundation not on land, but on water. He was a carpenter who saved hundreds of animals during a flood by constructing an ark based on biblical inspiration, which initially drew ridicule from many. This leads us to story number 18, the Ark of Noah, crafted by a dreamer carpenter. The Netherlands, a country reclaimed from the sea, where dikes and canals form a part of the national character. Johan Huybers, a successful building contractor, led an ordinary life until one night he had a dream. He dreamed that a massive flood swept away his native province of North Brabant. The dream was so vivid and frightening that Johan took it as a divine sign. He opened the Bible, found the chapter about Noah's Ark, and resolved, "I must build one just like it." His wife Bianca thought he had lost his mind. "An ark," she said. "You don't even know how to swim." The neighbors shook their heads, but Johan was a man of action. In 1992, he began constructing his first ark. It was half the size of the biblical one, but still immense. He built it in his garden, and soon the bow of the ship began to loom over his neighbor's house. After 13 years, in 2005, the ark was complete. He launched it into the water and immediately sold it, realizing he had built the wrong kind. It was a children's ark. He needed a true, full-sized one. In 2009, he began anew. This time, everything was genuine. He enlisted a team of amateur carpenters and volunteers, using Scandinavian pine, as he believed Noah might have done. The dimensions were taken directly from the Bible: 300 cubits in length, 50 in width, and 30 in height. This resulted in a ship measuring 130 meters long, towering like a 5-story building. In 2012, Johan's ark was completed. Yet, an empty ark is merely a vessel. Johan filled it with animals. Naturally, not every creature was represented by pairs, but rather by life-sized plastic models: elephants, giraffes, lions, crocodiles, and a few live animals: ponies, goats, peacocks, and parrots. The ark turned into a tourist attraction. Thousands of people flocked to see the creation of the Dutch eccentric, and in January 2018, Johan's dream nearly became a reality. The Netherlands was struck by a powerful storm. The winds were so fierce that they dislodged several pontoons to which the ark was tied. The massive vessel broke free from the dock and began to drift, colliding with other ships in the harbor. Fortunately, there were no significant damages. However, Johan Huybers, a man labeled as insane, proved that sometimes the wildest dreams can offer the most reliable protection from reality. Johan constructed the ark to escape the water. On the other hand, the hero of our next story immersed himself in the water to save others. He was a doctor who invented the world's first submarine, capable of rescuing crew members from sunken submarines, and he himself became its first tester. Story number 19. The inventor who traversed the seabed on an underwater bicycle. The late 19th century. The world is gripped by an invention frenzy. Thomas Edison ignites the electric light bulb. Carl Benz builds the first automobile. Meanwhile, a young American named Simon Lake, inspired by Jules Verne's novel 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, dreams of conquering the ocean depths. But Lake is not just a dreamer. He is a brilliant engineer. In 1994, he constructs his first submarine, the Argonaut Jr. It resembles a triangular box made from pine boards, covered with canvas. It moves using hand-crank levers, much like a bicycle. Most importantly, it possesses wheels. Lake believed that the future of underwater vessels was not about swimming like a fish, but rather about moving along the seabed like a car. That same summer, he lowered his underwater cart into the river. He traveled along the bottom for several miles, breathing through a tube leading to the surface. He was laughed at. The newspapers dubbed him the Mud Turtle. But Lake did not give up. In 1997, he built the Argonaut 1, a true 36-foot steel submarine. It was equipped with a gasoline engine for surface navigation and an electric motor for underwater travel, and it had wheels. Additionally, it featured a revolutionary element, a lock chamber. This was a compartment from which a diver could exit directly onto the ocean floor without flooding the vessel. In the winter of 1998, during a fierce storm, the Argonaut got into trouble, being thrown onto the shore. Everyone believed it was irreparably damaged, but Lake and his crew repaired the vessel overnight, pushed it back into the water, and embarked on the first long-distance journey ever taken by a submarine. They traveled 2,000 miles across the open sea, from Norfolk to New York. During this voyage, Lake achieved feats that left everyone in awe. He descends to the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay, emerges through a lock, and harvests oysters. He then calls to the surface using the world's first underwater telephone to announce, "Dinner is ready." Simon Lake never received recognition from the United States Navy, who opted for the torpedo submarines of his competitor, John Holland. However, it was his inventions, the lock chamber, the periscope, and buoyancy tanks, that laid the groundwork for all modern submarines. Lake was a man who was 100 years ahead of his time, a genius who not only dreamed of Captain Nemo's realm, but actively constructed it with his own hands. While Lake conquered the depths, the hero of our next story triumphed in the skies. He was a clergyman who built an aircraft from silk and whalebone and achieved the first successful parachute jump in history, leaping from a hot air balloon at a height of 1,000 meters. Story number 20. The Heavenly Umbrella and the First Leap into the Unknown. Paris, October 22, 1797. A massive crowd gathered above the Monceau Park. Aristocrats, onlookers, and scholars all gazed skyward. There, at nearly 1,000 meters, hung a hydrogen balloon. Below it, in a woven basket, stood a man. His name was André-Jacques Garnerin. He wasn't just planning to fly, he intended to fall. Garnerin was a student of the famous Professor Charles, the inventor of the hydrogen balloon. During the French Revolution, he was captured by riflemen and spent 3 years in a Hungarian fortress. It was there, in his cell, looking through a tiny window at the sky, that he devised a plan for escape: to jump from the fortress wall using a giant umbrella. The escape attempt failed, but the idea remained. Upon returning to Paris, Garnerin decided to perfect it. He created the world's first reusable parachute. It was a 7-meter silk canopy without a hole in the center, with 36 lines attached to the basket. No one knew if it would work. Physicists predicted that Garnerin would either be torn apart by the speed or suffocate in the thin air. And so, he was in the sky. He waved at the crowd, cut the rope connecting the basket to the balloon, and stepped into the abyss. For the first few seconds, he plummeted like a stone. The crowd gasped in horror, and women fainted. It appeared to be suicide, but soon the silk canopy filled with air, slowing his descent. However, a new problem arose that Garnerin had not anticipated. The air trap beneath the canopy began to shake the parachute violently. The basket swayed back and forth with tremendous force. Garnerin felt nauseous and struggled to maintain his balance. He resembled the pendulum of a giant clock hurtling towards the ground. Yet he continued to descend. After a few minutes, he gently landed in the park, half a kilometer from the launch site. The crowd roared and raced to him, lifting him onto their shoulders and carrying him like a hero. He was pale and queasy, but alive. He had accomplished the first successful high-altitude parachute jump in history. Later, the scientist Jerome Lalande would recommend he make a small hole in the center of the canopy to stabilize his descent. Garnerin followed this advice, and the parachute took on the shape we recognize today. André-Jacques Garnerin paved the way for humanity, not just upward, but downward as well. He demonstrated that even from the most hopeless situation, such as a fall into an abyss, one can find a way out if they possess a silk parachute and a drop of courageous madness. Garnerin jumped from the sky, but the hero of our next story jumped into fire. He was a photographer who captured the eruption of Mount St. Helens from several kilometers away, leaving behind film that documented his final moments. This is story number 21, the photographer who filmed his own death. Washington State. On May 18, 1980, Mount St. Helens, which had been dormant for 123 years, was on the verge of awakening. Dozens of scientists and enthusiastic photographers flocked to the area to witness the rare spectacle. Among them was 48-year-old Robert Landsberg. He set up camp on a ridge just 7 kilometers from the summit. It was dangerously close, but Landsberg was obsessed with capturing the perfect shot. At 8:32 in the morning, the earth trembled from an earthquake. The northern slope of the volcano collapsed, resulting in the largest landslide in recorded history. And then a monstrous explosion occurred sideways rather than upward, as is typical. A massive cloud of superheated gas, ash, and rock, a pyroclastic flow, erupted from the crater at a speed exceeding the speed of sound. It raced directly toward Landsberg's camp. Robert realized he had no chance. He could neither run nor drive away. His vehicle was too far. He had mere seconds. In such a situation, most people would have panicked. However, Robert Landsberg was a photographer to his core. He continued to shoot. He aimed his camera at the impending wall of death and pressed the shutter as long as he could. When the cloud was nearly upon him, he did the last thing he could for posterity. He rewound the film back into the cassette, placed the cassette into his backpack, put the backpack on the passenger seat, and then laid his body over it as a shield. 17 days later, when rescuers reached his camp, they discovered a melted vehicle and Robert Landsberg's body beneath a layer of ash. Beneath him, in the backpack, the cassette containing the film was unharmed. The film was developed. The final frames he captured proved invaluable to science. They vividly documented the dynamics of the lateral eruption, enabling scientists to better understand this deadly phenomenon. Robert Landsberg did not merely perish. He left behind a testament written in light on celluloid. He used his body as a shield to preserve information that was more important to him than life itself. Landsberg left behind film, but the heroine of our next story left behind a mystery. She was a pioneering female pilot who broke all records. Yet, she vanished into the Pacific Ocean, leaving only a few cryptic radio transmissions that continue to intrigue researchers to this day. This is story number 22, The Last Flight of Lady Lindy. The Pacific Ocean. On July 2, 1937, a silver twin-engine Lockheed Electra soars above the endless blue. At the controls is Amelia Earhart, the most famous female pilot in the world. Beside her is navigator Fred Noonan. They are undertaking a global flight along the equator. So far, they have covered 35,000 kilometers. The most challenging and perilous segment remains. The journey from New Guinea to the tiny Isle of Howland, a flat patch of land just 2 kilometers long amidst the largest ocean on the planet. Waiting for them at Howland is a United States Coast Guard vessel and the ship called Itasca. Its role is to act as a radio beacon. Communication is unstable. Amelia reports that the weather is clear, but the cloud cover prevents them from pinpointing their exact location by the stars. Noonan, an experienced navigator, is forced to rely on dead reckoning. This method is imprecise and fraught with danger. At 7:42 in the morning, Itasca receives a message from Amelia. Her voice is weary yet calm. "We should be right above you, but we can't see you. Fuel is running low." Panic sets in on Itasca. They fire up their boilers to produce a plume of black smoke visible from the air. The radio operators desperately call to her, but all they hear is crackling static. At 8:43, Amelia sends her final message. Her voice teeters on the edge of hysteria. "We are flying on line 15737. We repeat, we are flying." And then silence. Amelia Earhart, Fred Noonan, and their Lockheed Electra vanished. The largest search operation in United States Navy history began. 66 aircraft and 9 ships scoured 250,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. No oil slick, no debris, no life raft. What happened to Lady Lindy, as the press dubbed her? Theories abound. Officially, they ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. Conspiracy theory suggests they were American spies, captured and executed by the Japanese. A romantic notion posits they landed on a deserted island and lived there like Robinson Crusoe. In recent years, a more plausible theory has emerged. remains of a fire, animal and bird bones, a crushed container of the freckle cream Amelia used, and a piece of aluminum potentially from her plane were found on Nikumaroro, several hundred miles from Howland. They likely made an emergency landing on the reef and lived on the island, signaling to passing planes until succumbing to hunger and thirst. Their final resting place became that very ocean which made them famous. Amelia Earhart did not reach her destination, but her mysterious disappearance transformed her from a heroine into a legend, an enduring symbol of bravery and the enigma held by the waters of the Pacific Ocean. Amelia vanished into the skies, but the hero of our next story disappeared on land. He was the Prime Minister of Australia who went for a swim and simply did not come back, spawning the strangest national joke and conspiracy theory. Story number 23. The Prime Minister swept away by the sea. Victoria, Australia, December 17, 1967. A hot summer day. The Prime Minister of Australia, Harold Holt, an energetic 59-year-old underwater diving enthusiast, is relaxing at his beach house. He travels with friends to Cheviot Beach, his favorite swimming spot. The sea that day is tumultuous, with high waves and a strong current. Holt's friends surveying the churning waters decide it's not worth the risk. However, the Prime Minister, known for his love of adventure and excellent physical condition, laughs it off. "I know this place like the back of my hand," he remarks as he steps into the water. He begins to swim. His friends watch him from the shore. Suddenly, they see him disappear beneath the surface. They wait for him to resurface. 1 second, 2, 10. He does not come back. Panic sets in. They call the police. Over the next 2 weeks, a massive search and rescue operation unfolds, the largest in Australian history. A fleet, aircraft, and hundreds of volunteers comb through every inch of the coastline. They find nothing. No body, not even a scrap of swimwear. The Prime Minister of Australia has vanished. The nation is in shock. How could the head of state go missing? The official explanation is an accident. Holt misjudged his abilities. He was swept away by a current and drowned. However, the absence of a body sparked a wave of the most bizarre rumors and conspiracy theories. The most prevalent was that Holt was a Chinese spy. He didn't drown but was picked up by a Chinese submarine waiting for him in the bay. This theory became so popular that Australians coined an ironic phrase, "to do a Harold Holt," meaning to disappear, to run away. Others asserted that he had been abducted by the CIA because he wanted to withdraw Australian troops from Vietnam. A third theory suggested he faked his death to elope with a mistress. The truth is probably much simpler and more tragic, but the mystery remains. In the city of Melbourne, a swimming centre was named in his honour. Australians, with their unique dark humour, considered this the best tribute to a man who loved the water so much that he remained in it forever. Harold Holt disappeared, but the heroes of our next story, in contrast, emerged out of nowhere. They were 2 children with unusual skin and an even stranger language who came out of a wolf pit in medieval England and became a mystery that still puzzles people today. Story number 24. The Green Children from the Earth. England, Suffolk County, the village of Woolpit, the 11th century, the reign of King Stephen. Picture a hot August day. Harvest time. The farmers working in the fields suddenly freeze. Strange sounds, resembling cries, are coming from one of the wolf pits, deep traps for predators. They approach the pit and witness the unbelievable. At the bottom stand 2 children, a boy and a girl. They are dressed in peculiar garments made of an unknown fabric, but the most striking aspect is their skin. It was distinctly green. The children spoke a language that no one could comprehend. They were frightened and crying. The farmers pulled them from the pit and took them to the village, to the home of the local lord, Sir Richard de Calne. They were offered food, but they refused everything until fresh green beans were presented to them. They devoured them ravenously. The younger boy soon fell ill and passed away, but the girl survived. Gradually, her green complexion faded, and she began to look like an ordinary child. She was baptized and given the name Agnes. She learned to speak English, and then she recounted her story. She claimed that she and her brother had come from the land of St. Martin, a place where twilight always reigns and all the inhabitants are green. Once they were herding their father's flock when they heard a loud sound resembling the ringing of bells. They followed the noise, entered a cave, and traveled through a dark tunnel for a long time. When they finally emerged into the light, they found themselves in a chalk pit, blinded by a bright sun the likes of which they had never seen before. What could this be? This tale, recorded by two chroniclers of the time, became one of the most enduring mysteries of English folklore. The rational explanation suggests that these were the children of Flemish immigrants who had lost their way. Their green skin might have been attributed to chlorosis, a malady arising from malnutrition, while the peculiar language they spoke could have been a Flemish dialect. The fantastical interpretation posits that they were aliens from another dimension or an underground world, accidentally entering our reality. From a folkloric perspective, they could have been fairies or elves, spirits of nature. The truth may never be known. Agnes grew up, married, and reportedly became quite lewd and audacious. Her trail disappears into history, yet the legend of the green children of Woolpit endures, reminding us that sometimes reality presents stories that defy any explanation. The green children hailed from another world, but the protagonist of our next story sought to create a different realm for himself. He was a physician who purchased a desolate island and settled there with a wife fashioned from wax, alongside hundreds of dolls strung up in the trees. Story number 25. The Island of the Dead Dolls and Its Mad King. Florida Keys, early 20th century. Karl Tanzler, also known as Count Karl von Kossel, was a German radiologist working at the Marine Hospital in Key West. He was a peculiar man, obsessed with visions. Throughout his childhood, the spirit of his great-grandmother, Countess Anna Constantia von Kossel, appeared to him, revealing the face of his one true love. In 1930, a 22-year-old Cuban-American beauty named Elena Milagro de Hoyos was admitted to his hospital. She was dying of tuberculosis. When Karl laid eyes on her, he froze. It was the very face from his visions. He fell madly and desperately in love. He attempted to save her, employing the most advanced and experimental methods, spending his own money on expensive equipment. But all was in vain. In 1931, Elena passed away. Karl was devastated. With the family's consent, he built her a lavish mausoleum. He visited her every night, speaking with her and singing her songs. But this was not enough. 2 years later, on one dark night, Karl Tanzler committed the unthinkable. He stole Elena's body from the mausoleum. He transported her home in a wheelbarrow. He placed her in his bed. However, time took its toll. The body began to decay. And so, using his medical knowledge, Karl started to restore her. He wired the bones together. He replaced the decomposed skin with silk soaked in wax and plaster. He filled the eye sockets with glass eyes. He made her a wig from her own hair, which her mother had preserved. He stuffed her chest cavity with rags, soaked in perfume, to mask the odor. He lived with this ghastly mannequin for 7 years, dressing her in clothes, tucking her in at night, and dancing with her. Neighbors considered him an eccentric recluse, unaware of the dark secret concealed within his home. The mystery was unveiled in 1940. Elena's sister heard rumors that Karl was having an affair with a massive doll and decided to confront him along with the police. What they discovered left them utterly shocked. Karl was taken into custody, but the statute of limitations for the grave desecration charges had expired. He was deemed insane and subsequently released. Elena's body was displayed for public viewing at the funeral home, drawing thousands to witness this macabre piece of art. Later, she was reburied in a secret location. Meanwhile, Karl moved away and crafted a new doll, an exact, life-sized replica of his bride. He passed away in 1952. He was found 3 weeks later, lying on the floor holding his final wax figure of Elena. Karl Tanzler fashioned his own eerie realm of love and death. Yet the protagonist of our next tale resided in a world where love and death were part of the profession. She was the most renowned executioner in English history, having executed hundreds and leaving behind a legend of a woman who knew all the secrets of London's underbelly. Story number 26. Lady Executioner, Queen of the Criminal World. London, the 15th century. A city of contrasts. Aristocratic carriages traverse filthy streets where the hungry and homeless perish. In this world, only the strongest survive. One of the strongest was a woman named Mary Freed, better known as Moll Cutpurse or Long Moll. She was a living legend. Moll is a diminutive form of Mary, while Cutpurse means pickpocket. She was a thief, a buyer of stolen goods, a brothel keeper, and the proprietor of a tavern where all the London riffraff gathered. But she was not your ordinary thief. Moll shattered all the stereotypes of her time. She wore men's clothing, a doublet and breeches. She smoked a pipe, cursed like a sailor, and engaged in duels. She was the first woman in England known to have smoked. Her audacity knew no bounds. Once, she wagered with a famous banker that she could ride from Charing Cross to Shoreditch dressed as a man. She won the bet, waving a flag and blowing a horn to entertain the crowd. Plays about her were presented at the Fortune Theatre while she was still alive. The playwrights paid her £20 to appear on stage in men's attire after the show to support the actors. However, the darkest part of her legend pertains to the role she was rumored to have occupied. Execution was a public spectacle back then. Executioners were figures who were despised yet deemed necessary, and it was said that Moll Cutpurse was one of them. She knew all the criminals in London, their secrets and weaknesses. When any of her clients were caught and sentenced to hang, it was said she would throw the noose around their necks. She did this not out of cruelty but practicality. It was part of her power and control over the criminal world. She died in her bed at a ripe old age, rich and respected in certain circles. Moll Cutpurse was an anti-heroine, a woman who wrote her own rules in a world that offered none to women. She became a symbol of freedom, albeit a criminal one, and proved that sometimes the best way to survive is to become scarier than those around you. They say the rules govern the world of shadows, but the hero of our next tale ruled over the realm of light. He was the keeper of a lighthouse that vanished along with two of his colleagues from a deserted island, leaving behind only peculiar entries in the logbook and a mystery that remains unsolved to this very day. Story number 27. The Enigma of the Lighthouse that Extinguished Itself. The Outer Hebrides, Scotland, December 1900. The Flannan Isles are 7 uninhabited cliffs rising from the icy Atlantic. Sailors refer to them as the 7 Hunters. On the largest of these, Aileen Moor, stands a lighthouse, the sole evidence of human presence in this harsh environment. 3 keepers man the lighthouse: Thomas Marshall, James Ducat, and Donald MacArthur. These are seasoned, sea-hardened men. On December 15th, the steamer Arctur, en route from Philadelphia, passes by the islands. The captain notices that the lighthouse is dark. This is a serious violation. Upon arrival in port, he reports it. However, due to a storm, the rescue vessel Hesperus can only reach the island 11 days later. On December 26th, Christmas Eve, Hesperus approaches Aileen Moor. Captain Joseph Moore sounds the horn. There is no response. He lowers a lifeboat. The pier is deserted. The lighthouse gates and entrance door are locked from the inside. Relief keeper Joseph Moore, who shares the same name as the captain, unlocks the door with his key and enters. Inside, there is an eerie silence. In the kitchen, plates with uneaten meals, salted mutton, and potatoes sit on the table. One chair is overturned, and the clock on the wall has stopped. The beds in the bedroom are unmade. The lighthouse lamp is polished and fueled, ready to be lit, yet no one is present. Moore discovers the logbook. The last entries are chilling. On December 12th, Thomas Marshall, the senior keeper, writes, "The wind is of a strength I've never seen in 20 years. James Ducat is very quiet. Donald MacArthur is crying. This is strange." First, MacArthur was known as a rowdy and a fighter, a man one would find difficult to imagine in tears. Second, on that day, there was no storm in the vicinity of the islands. The weather was calm. On December 13th, the storm persists. We are all praying. December 15th bears the final entry. The storm has ended. The sea is calm. God is almighty, and that is all. An investigation begins. Every inch of the island is searched. On the western side of the pier, traces of a monstrous storm are discovered. Rails have been torn away. Supply boxes, situated 30 meters above sea level, are smashed and scattered. The official version is that during a storm, which was not recorded on weather maps, a giant killer wave struck the pier. The two keepers, Marshall and Ducat, went out to secure the equipment. As they were being washed away, the third, MacArthur, ran out to help them without a coat. His raincoat was left hanging on a hook and was taken along with them. Yet this explanation does not clarify why the experienced keepers broke the primary rule, never to leave all three simultaneously. Why did they leave the lighthouse unattended, and why did they write about the storm 3 days before it supposedly occurred? Other theories, ranging from alien abductions to attacks by sea monsters or madness gripping one of the keepers, remain mere speculation. The mystery of the Ellen Moore Lighthouse remains unsolved. 3 men simply vanished into the mist and the roar of the ocean. The keepers disappeared. However, the protagonist of our next story appeared out of nowhere. He was an individual who arrived at Tokyo Airport with a passport from a country that does not exist, leaving the entire Japanese immigration service perplexed. Story number 28. The passenger from a non-existent country. Tokyo, Haneda International Airport. July 1954. The day was similar to countless others. Planes arrive, passengers go through passport control. Yet today the routine would be disrupted. A European-looking man in a respectable business suit approaches the immigration counter. He hands the officer his passport. The officer examines the document and frowns. The passport appears genuine, sturdy paper, watermarks, stamps, but in the nationality field it states Taured. The officer has never heard of such a country. He calls for a superior. They examine a world map together. There is no country of Taured. The man is taken to an interrogation room. He speaks several languages, including French and a little Japanese. He is indignant. He insists that Taured is an ancient state in Europe, located between France and Spain. When shown a map and pointed to Andorra, he becomes enraged. He claims that Andorra is a fabrication and that Taured has always existed in its place. His narrative is filled with details that baffle intelligence agencies. His passport is filled with visas and stamps from entries into Japan and other countries over the last 5 years. They all appear authentic. His wallet contains currency from several European nations. In his briefcase are documents confirming that he came for a business trip to a major Tokyo firm. The security service calls this company. They confirm, yes, we are expecting this person. We have a meeting arranged with him. The situation reaches a standstill. The Japanese decide to accommodate the mysterious passenger in a hotel room on the top floor, right by the airport, while they sort things out. 2 guards are placed at the door. The next morning, the officers go to the room. It is empty. The window is locked from the inside. The door was guarded all night. The only exit is from the 15th floor. There are no traces. The man from Taured has vanished as mysteriously as he appeared, along with all his belongings. What was this about? This tale, often referred to as the man from Taured, has become one of the most famous urban legends regarding time travel or alternate universes. Skeptics suggest it was likely a clever hoax or a story embellished over time. Possibly, it was a con artist with a highly sophisticated fake who managed to escape. But supporters of the paranormal theory are convinced it was a random glitch in the Matrix. A person from a parallel reality, where history diverged slightly, momentarily slipped into our world, only to be returned. We may never know the truth. However, the story of the man from a non-existent country remains as a reminder that our reality may not be the only one. A man from Taured crossed the boundaries of worlds, yet the protagonists of our next tale transgressed the limits of art. They were counterfeiters, who crafted replicas of such an exceptional quality that they were deemed more sophisticated than the original, leading to a financial collapse in an entire country. This is story number 29. The Swindler Who Printed Real Money. Lisbon, 1924. Portugal is undergoing an economic crisis. Inflation, poverty, political instability. In this murky stream swims a fish named Arthur Alves dos Reis. He was not merely a fraudster, but an artist, a genius whose scheme is still studied in economic institutions as an example of financial surrealism. The plan that hatched in his mind was devilishly simple and audaciously bold. He did not intend to counterfeit money. He planned to print it. Officially, Reis forged a contract. Not just any contract, but a clandestine agreement supposedly from the Bank of Portugal. The document claimed that the government entrusted him, as a secret agent, with the printing of a vast quantity of 500 escudo banknotes for financial aid to the Portuguese colony of Angola. The operation was, of course, highly confidential. Armed with this contract, complete with forged signatures and seals, Reis traveled to London to approach the firm Waterloo and Sons. This was the very printing house that produced authentic Portuguese escudos for their government. The director, Sir William Waterloo, initially hesitated, but the documents appeared flawless. Reis was charming and convincing. Ultimately, greed prevailed. The printing house agreed to execute the secret government order. They printed 200,000 banknotes of 500 escudos each. This was an astronomical sum, nearly 1% of Portugal's GDP. Most importantly, these were not forgeries. They were printed on the same presses, using the same paper and the same inks from the same plates as the official currency. Distinguishing them was impossible. Moreover, some of these banknotes bore serial numbers that were already in circulation, which was a common practice due to printing defects. Reis and his accomplices began to import the money into Portugal. They established their own bank, the Bank of Angola and the Metropolis, in order to launder the money, offering low-interest loans and investing in industry. For a time, Reis became a national hero. He injected vast sums into the economy, creating jobs. The country began to emerge from the crisis. No one was aware that this economic boom was an illusion built on money created out of thin air. The scam was revealed accidentally. A bank clerk noticed an unusually large number of brand-new banknotes with identical serial numbers entering his cash drawer. An investigation was launched. When the truth came to light, Portugal was engulfed in a financial collapse. Trust in the national currency had been undermined. The Bank of Portugal was forced to withdraw all 500 escudo notes from circulation and replace them with new ones. Arthur Alves dos Reis was arrested. At his trial, he conducted himself like a performer, claiming that he acted for the good of the country. He served 20 years in prison and passed away in poverty. However, his trick entered history as the most brilliant forgery that was not a forgery. Reis played with the economy, but the hero of our last story toyed with physics. He was a monk who created the world's first electric car 100 years before Elon Musk, relying solely on faith, science, and a bit of sulfuric acid. Story number 30. The monk who invented the future in his monastery cell. Hungary, Benedictine Monastery, 1828. In the silence of his cell, surrounded by ancient tomes and crucifixes, a monk named Ányos István Jedlik leaned over a peculiar device. This was not a prayer, it was science. Ányos Jedlik was not just a priest, he was a brilliant physicist and inventor. While his brother monks recited psalms, he studied the works of Volta and Faraday. His cell resembled more of an alchemist's laboratory. There were flasks, wires, magnets, and galvanic elements scattered everywhere. That year, while experimenting with electromagnetism, he created what would later be known as a dynamo. He discovered the principle of self-excitation, ahead of Werner von Siemens by several years, who received all the acclaim. But Jedlik did not stop there. He gazed at his small buzzing electric motor and posed a question that would have changed the world if it had been heard. Could one ride on this? He built a small cart. On it, he mounted his electric motor, which drove the wheels and a primitive battery. This was the world's first electric car. Imagine this scene. Through the corridors of the ancient monastery, among portraits of saints, a small self-propelled cart glided silently. It was the year 1828. Nearly 60 more years would pass before Carl Benz introduced the first gasoline-powered vehicle. Ányos Jedlik demonstrated his model, which he called the lightning magnetic carriage, to a student at the university where he taught. But the world was not ready. The idea seemed a mere toy, an eccentric monk's whimsy. No one recognized this buzzing cart as a precursor to the future. Jedlik did not patent his invention. He wasn't a businessman, he was a scholar and a servant of God, for whom understanding the world was a form of prayer. He continued his experiments, creating the first commercially available carbonated water. Yet his greatest creation remained a model a century ahead of its time. Only in the 21st century, as the world succumbed to an electric vehicle craze, did science historians recall the humble Hungarian monk. His tiny cart, preserved in a Budapest museum, is a silent reproach to humanity that could have been traveling on clean energy 100 years earlier had it listened to the genius of Jedlik. And so, this final chapter of the cycle is closed. We laughed at Sam's war, admired the audacity of the man who sold a tower, shuddered in horror at the tale of the dancing plague, and marveled at the genius of the monk who built the electric car. These stories are not merely amusing facts. They serve as a mirror, reflecting the strangest, most unpredictable, and astonishing thing in the universe: human nature. The ability to dream, make mistakes, take risks, create, and occasionally act in ways that defy convention. The archive once again retreats into the shadows. However, keep in mind that the most extraordinary tales do not always involve kings and generals. Sometimes they unfold with your neighbor, the mailman, or an ordinary farmer. Just remain observant. The world is filled with wonders waiting to be shared. Thank you for being here.